Hi, Christina. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me on, Krista. I'm so excited to be on here.
Me too. I'm so excited that you've come to the show and that we're going to get to talk about your work. And I'm really interested in everything that you're doing. So I can't wait to sort of unpack your journey here today. So I always like to give my guests an opportunity to introduce themselves in their own words to the listening and viewing audience. So I'm going to pass it back over to you and then we'll get into this interview.
So my name's Christina Prokos. I am what I refer to myself as like a life coach and a spiritual coach when I first started off on my journey. However, I am a psychic medium. I am someone who does a lot of inner child work and work with people's traumas. And that's like my main objective. And I do a shamanic process of soul retrieval and a lot of inner child work with a lot of my clients, which is great because mediumship and all like the psychic intuitive aspects of things kind of weave in with a lot of this stuff as well. But that's kind of like the basics of what I do. I mean, there's so much more, but
There's
like,
so
let's
much.
sum
Yeah.
it up.
Yeah. And we're going to talk on, I have lots of questions about the soul retrieval, which I'm sure that just has piqued everybody's interest as you've just said that. So we're definitely going to unpack a lot of that. I can't wait to sort of get through that with you. The next question is, I originally started this podcast with the intention of creating a spiritual like middle place for people who've left their religion of origin. And most of us, at least in the Western world for sure, and parts of the Eastern world get plunked into something really specific. But then we find ourselves on this spiritual path and sort of incorporating a lot of ideas and philosophies and religious, aspects. So for you, what was that? What did you grow up with as a child? And then
So I grew up Greek Orthodox.
Okay.
So I was in a traditional Greek Orthodox, very involved in the community as well growing up. So I was involved in the church quite a fair amount. I did like traditional Greek dancing. Like I was immersed in my culture and I still love it. And I still love the church and I love the history, like the Byzantine era, the Latin, the chants and all of that is still something that I often even play when I'm in meditation sometimes. But I knew that I needed to evolve and grow from just what the religion itself was. I did find that there was so many restrictions when it came to the role of what a woman is allowed and how she's allowed to operate. Like we can't even wear pants in our church. Like it's skirts. And if you go to, if you've ever been to a monastery, you have to wear like a headscarf. Like there is a lot of traditional elements to that, which I respect. But I had a little bit of a rebellion against too, because I really wanted to express what the real truth of a divine feminine energy is. And then of course, being psychic and intuitive and seeing people who've crossed over, like that again is a big no-no in the church, right? There's there's a lot of beliefs around not knowing of your future or not being able to tap into being psychic as if it's something really bad, but it really isn't. I've actually sat down and had conversations with more modern priests in the Orthodox Church, and they were just like, hey, listen, if you're just content and you're not harming anyone, then you're still loved and, you're appreciated. But I had to separate a little bit of that. Not to say like I still incorporate a lot of prayer. I, still love the traditions and the culture, but I don't necessarily go to church all the time like I did before. Yeah.
So Greek Orthodoxy is really beautiful as a religion. And just like a lot of, like in the Hispanic culture that I grew up with, Roman Catholicism and your ethnicity, they're one and the same. There's not really any,
it makes you who you are too. I can't reject that part of me. It's how I was raised, and my grandmother had strong beliefs with it, and she was also very intuitive, and my great grandmother was, and so there's a lot of this history around, having these intuitive abilities and these gifts, but then also being devoted to God, or like really heavy in prayer. My grandmother used to sit and just like. I remember her in her chair. I'd come downstairs and she'd be like reading in her prayer book, and that was a big thing for me still, right? I'm not going to lie. There was
a big influence.
When I was 12. This is a funny story. When I was 12, I was telling everybody that I wanted to be a nun. I'm not joking. I was like, I'm going to be a nun. And my parents like, yeah, okay. But there was a point, right? Where you like, when you're brought up in a specific way, there is that adaptation and influence that plays a significant role, right?
Right. And the highest form you can have in the feminine divine is a nun in those religious aspects,
I was
right?
searching for that divine feminine type
Yes.
of expression. And it was like at 12, that made sense to me.
Totally. Yeah, totally. I get that. Well, I'm really interested in how you came to this work. And I think what you're talking about back there as well is like sort of a reclamation of your lineage's power and living into that with your psychic abilities and all of that. So like, did you have a lot of trauma going up and like whatever you're comfortable with? Like, how did you come to be, most healers have been through it, right? And we're trying to ease the suffering of others. How did you become a healer? How did you get to reclaim yourself in this aspect? Like, this is just really beautiful.
So I was born with extrasensory gifts. So like navigating in my childhood and seeing the things that I saw and feeling the things that I felt was very difficult for anyone to understand because I didn't have even the language to express it for myself, right? But my parents had a really toxic relationship dynamic. But back then it just was what it was. You just kind of married someone and you stayed with them and like you had to go through the hardships and like there was no real conversation around mental health and no real conversation around healing addictions and there was no support. There was toxic family dynamics. Like as much as I loved my grandparents, they really enabled a lot of my father's addictive behavior patterns, which made it very difficult for my mom to navigate her role as a feminine in her life and her experiences to find the support that she needed. And she didn't have family here. She was born in Canada, but raised in Greece. And so when she came here, she really didn't have a support system. And so, she got married very young. My dad and her got married. By the time she was like 21, she had me. So like she was very young. They didn't know much. And their relationship was just really, really unhealthy. I mean, they're better now. They're still together, which is like crazy to think about, but my mom and I had a horrible relationship growing up. It was very, very difficult navigating that relationship with her. In a lot of ways, I think she thought I was a lot like my father. And so she tended to project a lot of her anger and frustrations towards the inability to heal that relationship. And so she tried to create that dynamic with me or try to resolve that conflict with me and subconsciously wanted me to represent that balance for her or represent that self-regulation for her or represent that ability to resolve conflict for her. And I just wanted to be a kid. I was struggling so much already with being super sensitive and psychic and intuitive and not being understood that it was such a difficult dynamic growing up. And I will say that I think that did help me develop the character that I am now. And it really helps me understand trauma on a completely different level. My mom, unfortunately, was probably, and I would say undiagnosed bipolar and had a lot of mania as well. So we saw a lot of manic episodes growing up, which was just like would put you in a fawn response, would put you in a freeze response and not, or fight or flight to a degree. Right. So,
whatever response kind of calmed the situation down.
Yeah. And so she was a very violent person too. So I went through a lot of physical abuse as well from my mother. We do have a very good relationship now, but it took years of us building that and healing that and, finding balance again and just boundaries. Cause like she can still go against certain things, but she really has apologized for a lot of the things that have happened. And she has actually acknowledged like, yeah, it was because it didn't resolve issues with your dad. And as much as I loved my grandparents because they were such a huge part of my upbringing, they really helped in so many ways for me. They were awful to my mom. So they weren't supportive. They weren't there. They weren't, helping her when she needed someone to say like, hold my husband accountable to his behaviors. My dad was a gambler. So there was always money issues growing up. There was always like, we lived with my grandparents because he basically gambled our house away at like a very young age. Yeah. So we were like tossed around like rag dolls. We weren't regulated. We didn't have stability. We didn't have like, I don't even remember, like asking for things and being able to say like, here, yeah, you could have it. It was always like a struggle or always an issue. And then once I turned like 15, I was like, okay, I have to work. Like, I need to like figure out an outlet. I need to get out of here.
Yeah.
I did have
I need
like,
to support myself.
right. I have to support something. I have to figure out a solution. But there was such an influence for me growing up. And funny enough, I have a sister and she went the opposite way. So like you could grow up in the same type of environment and your adaptations, the way you're going to operate could be two different extremes. And so because I was super sensitive, I internalized a lot. And then the anger was the only way that I knew how to operate and motivate myself to become a better version of myself. But in that, I made so many mistakes because there was no guidance. There was no, like, nobody took my hand to help educate me in a way or mentor me in a way to teach me to be the best version of me. And that's kind of how I turned into like being the person. I was like, well, if I'm going to figure out the solution for the problem, then what if I could be that for others? Like if I've got all these experiences and I have grown through the wisdom and understood trauma to a degree and add my gifts and add my abilities and add everything else, I just embraced it eventually. I was like, well, this is my path and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to mentor people. I'm going to help them understand and guide them, because when I'm dealing with a lot of my clients and I see that their traumas, they didn't have that. And I can relate to that in so many different ways. So yeah, childhood was crazy.
Well, and it's like, it's a cheesy saying that we hear in our spiritual circles and in the healing circles, is that we become the people we need when we were children. You're speaking directly to that and being able to alchemize your experience. I had not the same situation, but very similar signatures of that kind of life. But it was like, I also didn't want to come into the world and injure people. As sensitive beings, we don't even have the language for that when we're young. And when people are injuring you when you're young, you can't understand it. It's so bizarre because you're such a sensitive and feeling creature that you're just like, why would they do this? And so for me, my motivation was because it's learned behavior, right? So I'm sure you dealt with this as well, but the learned behavior in my family, the unconscious learned behavior. And then I was like, wait, I don't want to be like this. I don't want to injure the world around me. And I had to take a really big pivot. It sounds like you did too. There's a lot of work around the mother wound. And I think it feels more significant, I feel like, on the feminine side. It's not to say that men can't have a mother wound with their mother, because they do.
Oh, yes, they do.
But they do. Yes. And they do. But there's something about that gender resonance that it's the depth of it, I feel like, goes so deep and wide, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like through the work that I've been doing for X amount of years, I mean, and working with the universe and the universal constructs and understanding collective consciousness, like the mother wound is like the experience in itself is teaching you how to navigate your relationship with the universe.
Yeah.
And so when you really examine the relationship dynamic that you had with your own mother, it's going to give you a great understanding of how you operate with the universe. And what your limitations are and what abundance looks like and how you express your intuition and your divine feminine and all of that. So it's a good gauge for you to kind of like do the work in that way and say to yourself, like, if I want to manifest better experiences, or I want to move towards a different direction, or I want to change something in my life, examine the mother wound, because that's going to give you an opportunity to say, okay, how have I adapted the belief systems? How have I adapted maybe a personality type like hers, coping mechanisms,
right?
All these aspects of whether I like it or not, they're still made in my DNA. It's a genetic composition. It's there. And so I have to kind of examine that and be like, okay, well, if I want to really learn how to work with the universe, then I have to heal these parts of myself.
Yeah, the coping mechanisms are real interesting, because I ended up going into hyper independence.
Oh, yeah.
Because I don't want to bother my mom, because she's made it very clear to me that I can't bother her, or, you know, whatever the case may be. And that was like the same relationship I had with divine source. Like I would always be like, hey, it's me. I don't know if you're busy or you got things.
Don't worry. Just like a little trickle. I just need a little trickle.
Just real quick. I know you got a lot of people. And I was just like, super, like, it's so funny you say that, because I definitely resonate with that experience as well.
And did you find that you would like self-sacrifice a lot or people please? Was that also like a tendency of yours?
has not been one of my strong coping mechanisms.
Okay.
Is hyper independence, that
Okay.
like and isolation, like doing everything myself, like
Right.
killing myself to do everything myself, so
Okay.
I don't have to be a burden to anybody else. Like
Right.
it's been a
Right.
lifelong journey. Is still a journey. And my parents are they're in their late or mid to late 80s, and they're in their basically their death process. And I'm like always
Okay.
telling my partner Graham, I'm like, I've got to readjust my will. And I was like, because now that I've gone through this experience of this, like having to take care of them, I'm like, I don't want to be a burden to anybody. And I'm
Oh
just
my
like,
goodness.
it's like an
Oh
exercise
yes,
of that.
so embedded in you for sure. Oh my God. Yeah.
And he's like, okay, you need to calm down. So it's just funny because it's like, we're just a work in
Mhm.
process of how that ends up. Like you said, those coping mechanisms, like how they present themselves
Yes.
throughout. I think it's also interesting too, how like none of us comes out of our childhood unscathed with our parents' personalities. Because
Oh
I
yeah.
used to think I wasn't like my mom. And
Oh
then
yeah. Isn't that always the case? There's like, even when I'm working with my clients and I'm trying to like make them aware of like how
yes,
they're operating, like, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to tell you this right now. You sound like your father or you sound like your
yeah,
mother. And they're like, but that's the part that I hate so much. And I'm like, yeah, but
I
it's
know.
such a huge part that makes you. And I want you to understand that if you could heal this part, there's something on the other side of that. And there is something really good with this too.
Mhm.
It's not so bad if you know how to really work with it in a very
Right.
positive way, like,
And there's a positive aspect of it if you
mhm,
flip it on its head or take it in its inverse, because
yeah,
that whatever that negative behavior was in response to a negative, external factor. And so like if you
yeah.
can find the root cause of it, you can heal it with yourself. Like it's really beautiful to do that work. But anyways, I don't want to go too far on a rabbit hole on the mother wound here because we have so
Well,
much
I'm
to
so
talk
happy that
about.
we get like touch base on that because it's so important. I think like I love that. I like that we just talked about it.
Yeah, it's good. I
makes
do.
me
So I
makes me
really
happy.
want to get into the soul retrieval thing because it's
Okay.
fascinating to me. It's a term that I don't think is being used quite readily. So I want to understand how
Mhm.
you came up with this term. But for baseline, let's tell the people what you mean by this, like what happens during this process, and like how are you using it to help people in their journey and their healing.
So, soul retrieval is actually a shamanic process. It's an old, ancient, like traditional ceremony that a lot of shamans tend to use to help integrate trauma and to help bring fragmented pieces from trauma back, soul
Mm.
loss, soul fragments back to a person after extreme amounts of trauma. And so, what has happened now is obviously there's an evolution in the spiritual community and the collective consciousness. And I'm going to say that there are specific individuals that have come on this planet who, myself included, who have the modern version of it integrated within their abilities. And so it's like I layer it within different levels when I'm doing inner child work, because there's like inner child work, shadow emotions, and then soul retrieval. And
Okay.
so each aspect, depending on where I'm going and traveling in, because when I'm working with a client and I'm tapped into their energy field, I'm actually feeling every experience that they've gone through, and I can see where the soul loss is, or the fragmentation in the consciousness is, or where
Mm.
that wound is coming from, the core wound. And it depends on how far I'm going in, but if it's like a massive soul loss due to like severe trauma, like sexual abuse, for instance, because that's a severe violation within someone, they're to survive that type of abuse, they detach a part of themselves, or that person who's abusing them takes this part of them. And so I go and I journey through what we refer to the other realms. I usually use my spirit animal. We navigate through that, and then I can actually see the trauma itself, the room, the place, the experience, all of it, and experience it with that person. And then I go and retrieve the soul part back and integrate it back within themselves. So it's
Mm.
kind of like faster than doing a ceremonial process, but I'm completely locked into. And so when I get out of one of these experiences, I explain to my client, like, this is what I saw. This is what happened. This is the area that I saw it be taken from. This is where your soul loss was coming from. And the client just goes, yes, yes, yes. Like, that's exactly what happened. That's where I was. That's to the degree of even being able to see like the furniture in the room. And so it's an immersive type of an experience, and it's intense, and it's not, I would say, for the faint of heart, but it would be for the individuals that have gone through. So yeah, but that's why I said I go through like building a lot of trust with my clients, and like
I'm thinking of you. I'm thinking about like the care that has to go into you after having to go through that experience, right?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, you have to develop the skill set. It's not something that you could, and I've done this now for like 15 years. So it really is something that I've put a lot of energy and time into. And like when you're navigating through these different realms, you have to mask your energy in different ways in order for you
shape shift energetically.
Yeah. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that people will maybe never understand, but maybe your audience is like, what is this? You know, but
think of them as masters level. So they'll all be here with us and all of this language and understand this really clearly.
Yeah. So a lot of it also has to do with like navigating all of that. And then, you know, I have my spirit animal, and she navigates through everything, and she shapes shifts, and she goes through whatever. And she basically protects me through the journey as well. And I bring in other protectors if I need to as well. But for the most part, it's pretty easy for me to do. I hate to say it like that, but it's something that I love doing, and I love doing it. And I think I'm really good at it, that my clients are just like, they love it. Like, it's just one of those processes. Yeah.
I'm always amazed when healers can do this type of work, because it seems so heavy, and it seems so arduous. And it, like you said, it's not for the faint of heart to have to go and do this work. And then also, I think there's something for anyone that's listening to this. Most people have probably had some level of trauma in their life, but also just having to confront your trauma with another person. Like, it's something to do it with your therapist who, you know, knows stuff like they do. And then there's like the spiritual therapists that you would consider like your healers, and all of those people. For some reason, to me, it feels more confronting to do it with healers, because I feel as if they can see you completely naked. Like, they can see you very clearly, and that can be so vulnerable. So like for the person doing that, it can be really vulnerable, but it's like so powerful.
Oh yeah.
I've done both in my life. Like, I've done talk therapy, and I've done somatic therapy with a spiritual healer, and the outcome is faster on this side. I can't quantify it or detail it in ways that would probably satisfy scientists, but like it just is faster. And there's something so vulnerable about coming into the space with the healer and saying like, I don't want to live this way anymore, and I need these parts of myself back. Like, can you get them?
So I also think it's layered. So like how you just said, I think is very impactful as well. Like, you did your talk therapy first, you know, and I think like that's important. I think like there's a place for that, you know? And I think like what's important is understanding that it is a layered process. And so by the time you get to the healer, you've ripped so many of those parts of yourself and vulnerabilities open that you're like, I've done everything now, and like, I don't know what's left. And I'm like, don't worry, we've got it. Now we're going to go into the depths of the darkness, because you're ready for it. You're ready to see that part of yourself. You're ready to go into those parts of yourself. And some people, you know, don't do the therapy, and they're just like, you know what? I'm here. I'm open. I want to build this relationship with whatever, the universe, or like my healing. And like, there's just something more that they understand from that different perspective. So I think like there's a spectrum, and I think it's like, I think it doesn't matter whether you've done one way. And most people who have done, not most, I would say some people who have come to me to do like the soul retrieval part, they did do therapy first. They had to.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's okay, because you're building some form of a foundation. And now we can work on that, because now you've opened your throat chakra and had this conversation. Like, especially when I'm dealing with people who've had like sexual abuse issues and that kind of trauma, it really blocks their throat chakra. And so going to talk therapy is helping that area build that muscle, that energy. And so then we can go to the next phase of whatever we need to heal and work through.
Yeah. And that exact sequence of events is what has happened in my life. And I know with a lot of other people is like, you're right. You get to this point where it's like, you could only talk about it so much. And then the healing return on in that investment sort of tapers off. And so you need to find the next best thing. And I think you're spot on with that. I definitely have experienced that in my life as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's heavy. I'm glad you're doing it. And I'm glad that there's space for that. But so let's talk about your psychic mediumship. I'm really curious. I love psychic. I'm not psychic. I wouldn't consider, I know everyone's kind of psychic, but like, I wouldn't consider myself psychic. I just have intuitive hits here and there and downloads that come. But so I'm always like super fascinated when people have this ability. I'm really curious how you use it to navigate, like not just your healing work, but just your life and interacting with the world around you and how it sort of shapes your view of the world. Talk to me about your psychic mediumship.
So when I was younger, obviously there was no filter. So it was much easier to kind of like navigate through everything and be like, oh, so-and-so's uncle's in this room and, you know, grandpa came to visit. And it was like confusing, you know, as you're young, right? Because you're like in a room full of people and they're like, who's here, who's alive and who's dead. And I can't tell the difference. Right. But then obviously in my teenage years, I thought it was normal because I just assumed everybody felt or thought or had these experiences. And I realized it wasn't. And so I dumbed down the sensory for many years. And then when I finally embraced it all over again, I realized that the purpose for it, mediumship in general, was to teach me to be a good mediator between different realms. And so when I'm talking to a deceased loved one, what I'm gathering is the collective of their DNA, the process of whatever's going on between the family dynamics, the lineage. Like I'm looking at not just saying, hey, your deceased loved one is here and, you know, they love you and they miss you. They're coming in and they're going, okay, here was the trauma and these were the experiences. This is where I effed up. This is what needs to be changed. You need to express this to them. You know, they'll give me information even as far as like, she's got soul loss here. This is the trauma. So they're giving me a context of information more than just, hey, your deceased loved one, and I'm going to give you some evidential proof that this is their name or this is how they operate. So really the mediumship has evolved to helping me heal trauma. And I love using it in that. It's almost like a bridge.
Yeah.
So I'm sure like some clients have come to me who've gone to go see so many mediums, but they've never touched on the trauma part. It's always just been like, just want to let you know, heal your grief. This is where we're at. This is what the message is. I wish you the best, so on and so forth. And I did do that at one point in time, but I would walk away and I would feel like there was something I didn't say or something I didn't offer more of, or like that just wasn't good enough. And then slowly throughout the years, especially once I started to understand more of like the purpose of my gifts and trauma and working and healing and doing inner child work and all of that stuff for myself and for others, it just evolved into having your deceased loved one come in and then talk to me about all of it and help me understand your ancestral trauma and how this has been something that's been passed on from generation after generation. And it's not necessarily your fault for having this type of adaptation, but it is a lesson that needs to be healed or a karma that needs to be balanced. And so we have to work on figuring out more of that. Because also when a deceased loved one crosses over and their consciousness is still around us, because it's mostly their consciousness, right? they're also spiritually evolving because time's not linear there. It's a completely different concept. And so as they're still tapped into this consciousness that they're having, and the more you're learning to evolve spiritually, they're also evolving spiritually as well to change and learn more, which then activates more of source consciousness, where then source learns more about themselves as well. So there's a lot that
like
kind
a
of
huge feedback loop.
it's a whole interconnectedness that it's because I operate from ninth dimensional perspective. I'm not operating from the mediumship perspective of like sixth or seventh or eighth dimensional perspective. Most mediums operate from like a sixth or seventh. So I'm 9D, and it's a whole other conversation because I'm really tapped into source consciousness at that point, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm really curious from your perspective in doing this work. Like, I know there's a lot of schools of thoughts on like whether we call them black sheeps, healers, light workers. It does feel like there's always one embedded in a family. Like everyone who's come to this podcast is that person in their family unit, in their ecosystem. But like when you're doing this work and you're looking at lineages, I think now because we have like the dawn of the internet, we can all see each other. In older generations, there wasn't that like quick connection to see that there are all these other people that would be doing the same work. But when you're looking backwards in a lineage, do you see that pattern as well? Like the one person that's trying to help the lineage out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Tell me
yeah,
about that. I'm real
absolutely.
curious.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I've worked with so many different clients, and I've said to them, I'm like, you're going to be the cycle breaker. Like unfortunately, you've chosen a really hard path. And,
Yeah.
and
Everyone hates that.
yeah, totally. I mean, I hated hearing it too. They're like, you're going to do this and you're going to, and I was like, no, I'm not. That's not happening. Leave me alone. Like, I'm so tired. Right. It's exhausting too. I think that when you take on some form of a responsibility, because you have to understand too, like as much as we're coming in here, we may not necessarily remember a lot, but we did have an objective prior to coming into here.
Correct.
And you coming in here and choosing your path and your experiences and your gifts and your journey and embracing all of that is helping a spiritual evolution within your experiences, whether it's impacting this DNA and reframing certain things or for the next generation to come and so on and so forth. And so I really do look at that. And sometimes I've seen people who I've had conversations with that are extremely old souls, and I can see how tired they are in the physical realm. And I'm like, you don't have to work so hard. Like your presence alone, your energy alone is because you're a catalyst. It's already, you walk into a room and you're already fucking shit up. Do you know what I mean? Like it's already causing stuff to happen. And so they're just like,
even really? Just our mere consciousness.
Yes. Yes. The more aware you are too, that's going to trigger people whether we like it or not. Right. And so that's what we need more of. We need more of like people just kind of becoming aware of themselves. And then at the end of the day, that impacts others around them. But yeah, when I'm working with people, like I've seen a lot of my clients, I can tell what soul level they're at. And then I can go in and say, okay, well, this is kind of what you're working on. And these are your themes. And they're like, yeah, that makes sense based on why I'm having these behaviors or cycles or patterns that I'm aligning with. And then we look at all of that and we go, okay, well, what's the plan here? Like, what do you want to focus on? And how do you want to make this better? So like, if you've come in with, I'll just give an example where it's like, okay, well, if you're having a really hard time with abundance and it's been something that's been going on, this lineage around like money, abundance, all of that, then we're going to look at your lineage around like the feminine power, the feminine energy, like it goes back to the mother wound aspect of things. So we're going to go dive into that and see what your mom went through, your grandmother went through, your great grandmother went through, so that you have the ability to say, oh my God, like I can see where these belief systems are blocking me and I want to change that path for myself. And that's going to take a lot of bravery. That's the other aspect too. What most people don't understand, it's like there's no real manual to teach you how to be the best version of you. It's trial and error. And that's what you're here for. You're here to have a buffet of experiences. And through those buffet of experiences, it's going to help you, whether it's realign you because you're like, okay, you know what? I made a mistake here. I had a choice, I had an experience, or it's going to redirect you, or it's going to be exactly what you need. And none of those are wrong. They're all right. It's just however path you want to choose it. I'm going to say if you're going to be in a state of resistance to it, it's going to be harder. right? But if you're, willing to stop repeating the same behaviors and patterns, then, and you drop the resistance, you're going to line up with great, great experiences. It's not to say that it's going to be perfect, because it isn't. Healing isn't perfect, and it doesn't always feel good. And we have to acknowledge that healing doesn't feel good, because we have to bring up a lot of stuff, especially if you've been through so much.
Yeah, I often say on the podcast that like part of this work is just going into it knowing that if you're committed to it, you're going to have a sort of clarified state of stamina, because it does take a lot of tenacity and a lot of bravery, like you mentioned, to try to move through all of this. And if it was easy, like all of our families and ecosystems would be waking up at the same time, and, we would have heaven on earth, like, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, but because...
Do we need heaven on earth?
Well,
I think, do you know what I mean? Like, I love the concept, but that doesn't help our spiritual self evolve, because it would be beautiful to have everything in a utopia, right?
I think for me, what I would like is to not see physical harm to humanity. Like,
I agree with that.
That would be heaven on earth to me. I don't think things would be perfect, because I'm of the mindset, I don't know that source is perfect, because everything around us has signatures of imperfection. So I don't think, so perfect. We can argue the merit of the word perfection, but what I would like to see, my heaven on earth as defined by me, would be like no more physical harm to humanity. That's full stop.
Yes.
In all of its forms.
And animals for sure.
And animals too. Yes. Animals too.
Agreed for that. Absolutely too.
But I take your point. Yeah. Like we're here for a cause. And I was going to say that, there's some cognitive dissonance when you come into the spiritual path and someone presents to you the idea that you've chosen this, like you've chosen everything. I know for me, like I spent my first 5 years in foster care, was abused, neglected, all the fun things you get to pick up on your life journey, then got thrown into this really hard family system, all the things you pick up as well. And hearing that for the first time in the beginning of my awakening and unbecoming, it's so hard to hear that, because I'm like, wait, I chose this. And if I chose this, and it's like, you can go either way. You can go super dark and be like, well, shit, I fucking fucked my whole entire life up and this is crazy. Or you could go the route that I think a lot of light workers and healers go, and they pull their sleeves up and they're like, all right, well, what can I make of this? And I think there's no more beautiful, higher experience to have here. I think to your point, into the evolution of our own spirit and our humanness.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that, it's so sad to hear people suffer. I mean, when I hear it, I'm just like, it's like, I feel it to my core, and I don't want people to suffer. That's not the language that I want anyone to experience, especially when we say, you chose this path. And I would probably never say it if I was working one-on-one with someone at the beginning. I would, it goes back to having that dynamic. You have to build a rapport with your client and anyone that I'm working with, especially if they've gone through abuse, whatever level of that abuse is. I have to build a lot of trust with them first, and they have to learn what the universe represents for them. And then down the road, after they've seen so much change within themselves and have experienced so much with themselves, they embrace that light worker, warrior type of energy. And they're like, now I get it. Because
you can't be empowered in the beginning. No, when you're just starting to confront things, you can't.
I mean, I don't want anyone to think that that's realistic at all. Like I'm not, oh God, no. It really is. It is a process. Like you have to take the time to build a very healthy foundation and a sense of self within you in order for you to really then define why you chose this path to begin with. But from that place of empowerment, it's a whole other conversation than, you chosen here and this is why this X, Y, and Z. Because like I was molested as a child, so I would never be like, whoa, I chose that,
Right.
But, now I get it. Now I understand why it happened and what that has caused within me. And it also has helped me relate to so many other people who've gone through sexual abuse.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? I can go there. Some people who have never experienced that, they don't know what to do with the nervous system when it's dysregulated, or when they feel a sense of violation, or the boundaries are not there, or there's no sense of who they are. I understand that. And I know exactly what to do with that energy versus someone maybe who doesn't know how, or hasn't gone through an experience like that.
Yeah. And I think that the other piece there is like, in this line of like the evolution is, as soon as you get through, like, I would say like the hard part of your growth and your spiritual expansion and healing, and you start to become the person that you are, and you don't injure the world around you. You definitely don't injure yourself. There's also this like reality check that it's like, well, could we all be doing this? And I think for me, like I was like, it seems so simple. And I wanted to like tell everybody, like I wanted to get on the rooftops and be like, look, we don't have to live like this. We don't have to hurt each other. We don't if you just address what's happening inside of you, like, and it's not simple. It's not that simple.
No, because trauma leads, right? And
Yes.
so the unfortunate part is, even if we want to teach people how to be better versions of themselves, they're doing the best they can based on where they're at with their trauma, even to the degree of being an awful human being, right? And like that awful human being is also teaching us, reflecting back to us what we could do better. And how to show up to the world in a different light. I mean, if we didn't have that contrast, because everything in our lives right now is duality and contrast, right? And so when we're talking about like a buffet of experiences, we wouldn't know what it would feel like if we hadn't gone through those types of contrasts or had those types of experiences to awaken parts of ourselves to move into a healthier direction for ourselves. But it's so hard, because I see it for myself too. Like even with really great people, I'm like, well, what part don't you get that you keep repeating the same cycle and expecting a different result? And they're like, I understand that, but it's just, I can't. I'm like, no. It's just your trauma leading. So we just have to work harder in this area for you, because it's not emotionally intelligent enough. No. That's all it is. It's like, there's no emotional intelligence with that. So, because I worked with very high profile people that have like jobs that are like super demanding of their mental intellect. And yet when I'm talking to them emotionally, there's just no maturity. There's no emotional intelligence. They don't know how to tap into that sense, that part of themselves. And yet, they have these high profile jobs and they're addicts. And I'm like, well, why don't you think why can't you change that pattern? And from a mental component, they're like, well, I'm trying to have willpower and discipline. I'm like, but we're not looking at the trauma that's leading right now. And so we have to become aware of that. We have to understand that most of us are leading with our traumas, whether we like it or not. And it's our job to figure out and have the awareness of how we're not going to wound others. Like you were saying, to your point, we don't want to hurt others, but we do it without even realizing we're doing it, which is so sad sometimes to think about, right? Because it's like,
and it's so frustrating. I mean, like I'm not perfect either. If I wound somebody, I like am so mad at myself about it, because I'm like, what am I doing? But it's that unconscious whatever. If I'm getting triggered, or like, my response is something old and buried that I thought, like, I'm like, all right, well, I got to go back to therapy to talk about that, or like go back to my Reiki healer, and like, but it's just like, and it's just I think you're spot on. It's like we're all a work in progress. We're all doing the best we can, and we're all trying to.
I think the most important too is just the accountability part. Like if I wound you and I hurt you, instead of me being defensive about it or thinking that now I'm going to go and I'm going to self-isolate and I'm going to maybe even play the victim or do other things. It's like, no, just walk up to that person and take complete responsibility for that, complete accountability, and just say like, I may not, I also tell my clients too, like, you may not even have the language to explain it to them. You may not, you probably don't even know what you've done yet.
Yeah.
But you're
and it happens in an instant.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And it's just like, I always say with my clients, fundamentally, accountability and conflict resolve. Two very, very, very important things. I'm like, if you're willing to conflict resolve with anyone, and you're willing to redefine the relationship between the two of you, or peoples or experiences, then you're going to go a long way.
Yeah, in my family, like the conflict was a huge thing, and I was always scared of conflict, and no one ever apologizes for anything. So as I
Mm-hmm.
became, I love that you said that, because as I got more mature spiritually and emotionally, I started doing that for myself, and just going immediately to apologize, because I didn't have that, and I still don't with my family for some of the crazy stuff they've done. Like they just don't think they're in the wrong at all, and that can be really hard on people if you're doing the work. Anyone who's come to the show has had to deal with that. Just having conflict in your family systems or in your ecosystems, and then not having resolution or even compassion. Like that's so hard in the human experience. And I often say to people, like I landed in Buddhism later on in my life, and Buddhism is built a lot on the principles of compassion and tolerance and acceptance. And it's like I ended up having to give more of that out than was coming back. And that's okay, because
Okay.
like to your point, these people
Yeah.
are just where they are, and we have
Yeah.
to love them that way no matter what, like
Yeah.
that. We're doing our work, we're not doing their work.
I think too, when people don't know how to resolve or even apologize, their shame is leading, right? And
Yes,
so
yeah,
they just
totally.
don't know how to face that. They don't know how to be vulnerable, and they don't know how to be authentic, and they don't know how to communicate their role in that experience. And so shame leads in a lot of ways, and shame can create so much contrast within relationship dynamics. And yeah, so I just think like if someone is willing to see that they're causing pain, look at your shame,
Yeah.
and see how that's leading in your life and how it's pushing relationships away instead of creating that connection that we actually are really in need of. We really need each other. We really need to have healthier relationship dynamics with one another. And yeah, our shame does lead in a lot of different ways.
And we're all reaching out. Well, I'm mindful of the time here, so I wanted to talk to you. You launched a podcast called the Soul Thrive podcast. So let's tell the people what that podcast is about and what
Yeah.
you're talking about over there.
Yeah, so I launched my Soul Thrive podcast. One of my clients slash friends now, she was the one who was like, I really want to do a podcast with you. I think this is going to be great. Her name's Ivana. She's my co-host. She's phenomenal. She's a Virgo. I'm a Pisces. So there's a great dynamic there. She keeps me organized. So we decided to do like shadow work, talk a lot about shadow work and talk about inner child healing and trauma. So that's kind of the basis of the podcast. But then we invite a lot of guests over to share their experiences and their own childhood traumas and experiences and what they're doing and navigating through that process. So that's kind of what the podcast is about. And I love doing it. It's a whole other thing for me, because usually I'm on the other end answering questions instead of asking questions, right? So it's really, really, it's been great. And we've made some really great connections with a lot of people, which is nice.
Yeah, cool. Well, and where can everyone reach out to you on social media? Where are you at? Do you have events coming up? How can somebody
I
work with
just
you?
actually did an event not too long ago, but most likely in the spring, there will be another event that comes out. I do weekends host workshops. I do have my membership platform called Soul Thrive. It's like a membership platform that I have there too. You can look me up at a Christina_life_spiritual_. That's my Instagram handler. I know that whole is a whole other conversation. That was way before branding existed. So it's a lot. But yeah. And then, my website's www.ChristinaProkos.com.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. We'll put everything in the show notes so people
Thanks
can
so
get there
much,
easily.
Krista.
Yeah. We always wrap up in gratitude before we end the interview here. So I just always want to check with my guest about 3 things that are rolling around in their heart chakra.
Oh, I'm grateful for my dog because, honestly, he regulates me. And what I love the most about him is when I'm with my clients, he sits next to me. So he keeps me very grounded while I'm in my sessions, which I love so much. He's such a cutie, little Ollie. And then I'm really grateful for the relationship dynamic that I have with my mom right now. I really do feel like we've done a lot of work together and we've really executed some really great boundaries. And I'm super grateful for my community, the Soul Thrive members, because they are really amazing people. And they really hold even myself accountable to the work, which is fantastic.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I appreciate you coming to the show and
Thanks,
letting me
Krista.
highlight some of your work and all the things that you're doing. And I think it's really fascinating. And I'm glad that you leaned into your own work and that you decided to helped humanity in this really like beautiful and special way. So thank you so much for everything you do.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for welcoming on your podcast.
Yeah.
This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Ziomara, in alignment with Light Casting. Music curated and created by Mr. Pixie. You can find I'm Awake Now What on all social media channels by searching IANW Podcast. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, download, rate, and review. Come back every Sunday to partake in a new and enlightening conversation. May you be filled with love and light until we meet again.